Hello, everyone. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute, and I am happy today, well, not terribly happy given the background, but still, to introduce a panel on the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh and prospects for the future of the region. And I'm joined by two very distinguished participants. Lara Setrakian is an award-winning journalist and president of the Applied Policy Research Institute of Armenia, or APRI. Shujaat Ahmadzada is an independent analyst specializing in the Southern Caucasus, Russia, and Turkey. And I hope that we will also be joined by Ambassador John Evans, previously US ambassador to Armenia, but he seems to be having some problem connecting, so maybe he will be able to join us later. Shujaat, if I could begin with you, could you give me your perspective on the war, the Azeri victory, and on prospects for the future of Azeri-Armenian relations and the region? Thank you.
Thank you, Anatol, and the Quincy Institute for the invitation. And I second what you said about not being the perfect in terms of discussing all of this with regards to the things happened in our region as well as in a broader region with reference to the current escalation that's happening in the Middle East. But nevertheless, returning back to our region, the military fighting that took place between September 19th and 20th, which can be called, by us as a one-day war, has long been anticipated by many, both in Baku, in Yerevan, and also beyond these two countries. Because first of all, there were signs for this to happen on the very ground in terms of the troops deployment, as well as that has long been there when we analyze the parties and their interests and their strategic objectives. So I will try to explain how we ended up in seeing what happened on September 19th. And here I would still refer back to the end of the 2020 Karabakh War, which ended on November 9th or 10th, depending on your location, in 2020. So right after the war, after Azerbaijan won and retook most of its formerly occupied areas, the key strategic objective of Azerbaijan can be described, I describe it in that way, can be described as the 3D policy. And here, in my understanding, 3D stands for, as you can see from the name, the first is de-internationalization, the second was de-institutionalization, and the third was deterritorialization. With regards to the first, Azerbaijan has long tried to achieve the internationalization of the settlement process, that is, Nagorno-Karabakh becoming whole, only, and sole internal matter for Azerbaijan, as well as isolating Armenia as a kin state of a secessionist entity in Nagorno-Karabakh. And this goal has been practically reached back in April 2023, when Baku decided to establish a checkpoint on the Lachin corridor, which is the only road that connects the former Nagorno-Karabakh autonomous oblast areas with the Republic of Armenia proper. And at the end, we had the settlement process that got largely de-internationalized. And what happened on September 19th was the implementation or execution of the second goal, that was a de-institutionalization. For months, Azerbaijan has said that the existence of specifically quote unquote, the self-defense army, that is the local military units that are that were at that time under the control of the secessionist entity, are a threat to its sovereign and territorial integrity. And there was an argumentation that is coming from Baku on official discourse. And on September 17th, during this one-day war, if you can call it that way, the second objective has been achieved through the coercive meanings. That is, Azerbaijan forced Nagorno-Karabakh secessionist entity to surrender and lay down arms and to accept deinstitutionalization. As we can see from the ceasefire statement, Nagorno-Karabakh accepted to dissolve itself as an institution, as a political entity by the end of this year. So at the end, we also have this goal achieved by Azerbaijan. And after that, my understanding was that the third goal of Azerbaijan was the deterritorialization, that is, turning the whole area and integrating back to Azerbaijan in a way that it is not territorially united and territorially one distinct entity, but rather part of a larger Azerbaijan. And here we've seen some political arrangements have been made. But a thing that was, to be honest, not expected, I was not expecting, was the scale of the mass exodus, in a way that I was not saying it was impossible, but rather I was expecting especially Russians and perhaps the other stakeholders to get involved and not to let people to get out of the enclave. But there's something vice versa happened. That is, the almost entire Armenian population of the region left the area. And if we are speaking of the data, we have now UN saying that more than 100,000 people left Nagorno-Karabakh and ended up in Armenia to find a refuge. So we have in a region becoming largely devoid of its inhabitants. With a couple of points regarding the future prospects between Armenia and Azerbaijan, I think from now on, the goal will be more of like cementing not only this, but largely the victory that was achieved back in 2020, probably through some sort of legally binding way. So I think that Azerbaijan's main goal as of now, in a very specific terms, is to make Armenia predictable. That is, to prevent any possibility left, even hypothetically there, so Armenia can become once again a supporter of possible, even in a very hypothetical terms, a supporter of secessionism in Azerbaijan, and doing so by, let's say, by pushing the peace agreement agenda in which mutual recognition has to take place. But I think the scope of the tactics can be used in this way is not only limited to the peace agreement, and I think Azerbaijan is also trying to give the signal that Azerbaijan is ready for no peace, no war, let's say, period. That pretty much similar, like akin to what happened between 1994 and 2020, when Armenia and Azerbaijan did not have any kind of political agreement and just militarized, got arms, and made themselves ready for another round of the escalation. I think as of now, the key goal is to send the message that we will be doing fine if we get a peace agreement. But even if we don't, then the things are okay for us, and we can continue on living in a no war, no peace agreement, no war, no peace situation, which unfortunately I don't see any, let's say, positive getting out of it, given unfortunately, again, that is something that I'm underlying, given Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict theater becoming more and more, let's say, quote unquote, proxy war era in the amidst to all the global geopolitical rivalries that we are having in and around the region. And now what we have is Armenia and Azerbaijan are becoming less sovereign, are becoming less sovereign in terms of the agency that they have in this conflict settlement process. So from that perspective, I think the situation has become quite unpredictable in terms of what will come to next. Here I will stop, and I think maybe later on we can delve into details of the future prospects.
Thank you. Lara, I'd like to ask your perspectives on the situation, and especially on dangers for the future after what has happened. You're muted, I think.
Ironically, I had been saying that there's quite a lot to say, despite being on mute. Unfortunately, September marked the start of a very, very dark and dangerous chapter in the South Caucasus. The US and the EU had made it extremely clear to Baku that there should not be the use of force against the population in Nagorno-Karabakh, that the blockade that had preceded the military operation by Baku on September 19 was unacceptable. It was illegal. From December to September 19, you had a severe limitation of incoming food, fuel, and basic supplies to Nagorno-Karabakh. In retrospect, this looks very clearly like softening the target. So when the strike began on September 19, it was very easy to win. These people were hungry. They were not that sort of a blockade doesn't just affect soldiers or the elected representatives. It affected everybody, children, families. And so you had some very hungry and desperate people. Researchers I know at Columbia University had been monitoring caloric intake for children and families in Nagorno-Karabakh during that period. It had become very, very close to a starvation scenario by the time Baku launched this operation on September 19th. Ironically and very sadly, the elected representatives of that Armenian population had begun to climb down from their demands for independence. They were talking more about more conciliatory steps with Baku. That was why it was quite surprising to many observers, including at our think tank, when this strike was launched. It seemed as though there were many, many other paths forward for reconciliation between the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh and the authorities in Baku. As a think tank, we don't take any position on what the final outcome should have been, but certainly on how one should get there. And food deprivation, blockade, followed by a military strike, followed by the desperate fleeing of 100,000 people across the border was certainly not what we'd hoped to see when it came to the resolution of this issue after so many years. Now you have a refugee crisis in Armenia, 100,000 people in a country that doesn't have the means to sustain such an influx of population. Of course, very bitter distrust, a sense that there is no partner in Baku, no real partner for peace, because the ceasefire agreement of 2020, in its first stipulation, stated that there would be no military action around Nagorno-Karabakh. And so obviously September 19 was a gross violation of that. As a think tank that is constantly working for regional stability and peace building, dialogue wherever possible, what happened on September 19 makes everything more difficult. It's fascinating to listen to Shujaat, very happy to have the opportunity to do so. Deterritorialization is a very powerful word. Armenians had long suspected that Baku wanted this land without the Armenians on it. And that has indeed been achieved by the operation on September 19th. So Armenians have all but left the territory. They do not feel comfortable or safe going back after the blockade, after being, frankly, led to the point of starvation and then taking so much incoming fire. So where are we now and where do we go next? Azerbaijan currently occupies around 200 square kilometers of Armenian territory. Those are small pockets of land around the border between Armenia and Azerbaijan that have been taken in a series of escalations since May 2021. They are strategic pockets. They overlook the height. They have to hold the height, so they overlook much of southern Armenia. Much has been made about the risk to southern Armenia, the potential for an escalation that would allow Azerbaijan to cut across southern Armenia to its exclave of Nakhichevan and by extension to Turkey and beyond. That still remains a concern, although it seems as though the pushback from the West, in particular from Iran as well, might have de-escalated that in the immediate term. In the long term, there are serious concerns about encroachment onto southern Armenia. These are two countries that were meant to recognize each other's territorial integrity. Armenia did that. Nagorno-Karabakh has now been emptied of Armenians, but there is 200 square kilometers of strategic Armenian sovereign territory now occupied by Azerbaijan. And on top of that, what makes this situation so very dangerous is that the use of escalating military force has been absolutely validated. If you listen to the speeches of President Aliyev, he seems to say very overtly, they said there was no military solution, but we have essentially found a military solution. And so that sets up a dynamic whereby there is, of course, a superior military force and resource base in Azerbaijan that is used to escalate the situation, bite off pieces of Armenia, and force a ceasefire deal that then codifies those gains. So it's more a constant capitulation, escalation, capitulation, escalation, capitulation. And that has put all of Armenia on edge as to what piece of Armenia might come next. The price of peace that Baku seems to be suggesting is that they would now like 7 enclaves inside territorial Armenia, well beyond the border, that they say were part of Azerbaijan or sovereign to Azerbaijan during the Soviet era. So now the demands that we are hearing from Baku and from the diplomats mediating the peace process led by Brussels is that one of the conditions for peace is that Armenia ought to give 7 enclaves inside Armenia to Azerbaijan as a condition for peace, which is, of course, very dangerous for any sovereign country. They happen to be enclaves that sit on or near very strategic highways as well for Armenia. So very, very steep demand, concerns, again, for southern Armenia, and other demands from Azerbaijan that essentially signal a growing shopping list of political demands from Armenia as the price for peace. And many of those demands are ones that Armenia simply cannot afford. So you've seen from the current leadership in Armenia, it's much more than the population is comfortable for. The Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, very, very eager to make peace, ready to make concessions. But every time a concession is made, there's another series of demands that come forward as the next condition and the next condition for peace. So it's created not just a dangerous situation in terms of loss of life. I don't quite see it as Shujaat does in terms of, this sort of stable stasis, strange new equilibrium, no peace, no war. There are still incidents of open fire on the border. People are dying on the border. And so it is kinetic, and there's constant risk of escalation. That seems to happen, those escalations seem to happen when the world is preoccupied with other conflicts. The diplomats we speak to, particularly the ones from the US and Europe, are very, very concerned about what comes next, given that they were promised and pledged even hours before the escalation on September 19th that Azerbaijan would not use force. We have been told very clearly by diplomats that they were they had seriously taken the promises by Baku that they would not use force against the population of Nagorno-Karabakh. So what does that mean for Western leverage in this situation? What does this mean for diplomacy, for the peace process? All the very, very close relationship now between Azerbaijan and Russia and Turkey when it comes to energy exports and economic ties, the desire to push out the West and make this a regional picture. So basically you have more of a horse trading between Turkey, Russia, Iran, and Azerbaijan based on narrow interests rather than a rules-based, internationally led peace process. It starts to feel a bit more like what we've seen in Syria and less like what we were hoping for under the OSCE Minsk group. So these are the concerns. Norms have broken down. Ethnic cleansing was never supposed to be the way this gets solved, and it is essentially what's happened. But the issue is not over because you have these escalating demands from Baku that Armenia cannot possibly meet. If it does, it's damned. If it doesn't, it opens the door for a war that Armenia cannot afford. So that's how the situation looks from here in Yerevan.
Thank you. Before I turn to Shujaat again, just a note to the audience. Please put questions to the participants or to me in the Q&A. You will see it at the bottom of your screens. If you write those questions, I will pass them on to the participants in the second half of this discussion. Lara, I was going to come back to the whole question of international diplomacy and the role of great power actors in a second. But first, I wanted to ask Shujaat, these demands for territory, for enclaves within Armenia, is this in your view, something that Azerbaijan is actually hoping to get, or is this a means of putting pressure on Armenia to ratify, to sign a peace treaty on Baku's terms? And is there now a serious Azeri ambition or hope for some form of corridor across southern Armenia to Nakhchivan and Turkey?
Okay, thank you. So with regards to the very good point made by Lara on, unfortunately, comparing the situation with Syria, where this is where our second, your opinion that, yes, unfortunately, this is how the situation is becoming look like. Just one point before answering the question about enclave, that is, with nowhere, no peace, of course, that meant to be also having a lot of, escalation as well as the loss of life. Pretty much like we had until 2020, for example, we had more than 1,000 people got killed between 1994 and 2020. But even though that was called, nowhere, no peace period, but still. Regarding to the enclave, I think here we need to have a technical clarification before going into the larger dynamics in the negotiations. The first is, as of now, there are 9 villages that are under, let's say, question at the negotiations table. 8 of them belong to Azerbaijan under international law. 1 of them belongs to Armenia. Armenian one is an enclave. It's called Artsakhan, and it is located, surrounded by Azerbaijan, but located within, as an island, within, surrounded by Azerbaijani territories, but it is under Azerbaijani control since 992, sorry. And out of 8 villages that are under Armenian effective control, but are Azerbaijani per international law, only 4 of them are enclaves. That means 4 of them are surrounded by Armenian territories under international law, but they are Azerbaijani. And name of them would be, if you want, Karki, which is Armenians called Tigranashen in the south, where the strategic north to south, road to Iran bypass through this enclave. Then you have 3 in the north, Barkhudarlı, Sofulu, and Askipara was also, there's a neighboring Armenian village, Voskepar, which also connects Armenian-Georgian highway. But the 4 rest are not enclaves. They are bordering villages of the Kazakh region, which are under Armenian control. So I think here we need to have a technical differentiation. With those 4 bordering villages, I think the solution is pretty much easy. That is, the villages are being emptied and deoccupied. With regard to the 5, 1 Armenian, the 4 Azerbaijani, I think that is something that is not the most strategic point for both in Yerevan and Baku. On the other hand, that is being rather seen as a way, as a tool to use in the larger coercive dynamics within a negotiation to get the other things. So it is not the ultimate end goal.
And sorry, what are the other things?
The other thing would be, another one is what you referred, that is the extraterritorial or whatever type of the connection between western part of Azerbaijan and the Nakhchivan. It's escalate. Other would be demarcation and delimitation on which type of the, let's say, the maps and so on and so forth. The other would be humanitarian issues, that is the landmine map, even though most of it got resolved in one way or another. Then you have the missing persons information about them. You have around more than 4,000 people from the both sides that are still missing, but you don't have any data about them. That is also, unfortunately, is being seen rather a bargaining chip. So if you have a set of, let's say, a set of elements that are in concert with each other, and they're being, let's say, approached from one lens, that is, all of them are the bargaining chips, and you got to use them, exploit them as much as you can, so you can get the other goals. So from that perspective, I don't think, to be honest, that getting control over enclaves, it is something that is either die or live moment for Azerbaijan or Yerevan, but it is rather seen as the mean of achieving the other specific goals. Within that context, the specific goal for Azerbaijan, I think, would be recognition of its territorial integrity, i.e. peace agreement based on what is the reality on the ground, that is the post-2020 security situation. To be more specific, post-September 19th security environment. That is Armenia fully recognizing that whatever happened is there, and we recognize these results. From that perspective, I do see possibility of those enclaves being exchanged or swapped. I'm speculating, I don't have any data, but being exchanged, but in whatever, some sort of arrangement can be made, because they are not inherently the main issue. They are somewhere around the surroundings, they are surrounding the central issue. The central issue is that Armenia and Azerbaijan do not have these institutional and interstate arrangements. They don't have this. And to achieve this, there are different ways. And one of these is to exploit those areas to get deals signed upon the terms of the one party over another. That is the one with regards to the enclaves. I still do believe that is a secondary and largely seen as a negotiation chip, bargaining chip. With regard to the second question, that is what is the Azerbaijani perspective on the would-be, let's say, corridor between western part of Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan. So the origins of this understanding comes from November 10th agreement, where presumably, also with the Russian participation, it was agreed between Armenia and Azerbaijan and Russia that there should be 2 key roads under Russian control that would also give leverage to Moscow over both Armenia and Azerbaijan. One of them should connect Nagorno-Karabakh with Armenia, that is the Lachin corridor. The second should be on the southernmost parts of Armenia to connect Nakhchivan with the western part of Azerbaijan. And both of them should be under Russian control in one way or another. Both of them should follow the same logic, even though you can still argue that that was not the case with regards to the southernmost part of the Armenia, but still, the logic is coming from the November 10th architecture. And I think the goal was here just to make sure that Russia has long-standing, let's say, leverage over both countries in terms of the connectivity issues. The Lachin corridor doesn't function anymore. It is dead. November 10th agreement is not functioning anymore. It is just canceled de facto, if not de jure. Probably de jure will be canceled in the coming month or days, but still de facto is not functioning. So we don't have a basis for this coming from the, let's say, post-2020 architecture system. But on the other hand, we have the other party, that is Russia, is becoming more and more interested in seeing this road open, which aligns with its larger goals of decoupling economically from the Western economic space, so it can sustain its war efforts in the Ukrainian war, let's say, war zone, when it continues its invasion of Ukraine. That is to see, especially after Karabakh emptied from Armenians, when there is no basis left for Russian peacekeepers to stay. I think Russia's ultimate goal is to just secure the only hypothetical element and only unimplemented element of the November 10th agreement, which is the southernmost connection in Armenia, so it can continue its regional presence amid what is happening regionally to Russia. That is, it is losing more and more influence in the wider Eurasian space. So from that perspective, for Azerbaijan, both scenarios are fine, and there are a lot of options. Either you cooperate with Russia, you get extraterritorial one without any impeded access coming from Armenian side, or you make a deal with Armenia, that is, you accept the customs and checks, or you make a deal, you have already made deal with Iranians and go through other way, or you go through the Georgia. I think for Azerbaijan, it is just a matter of which side or which platform, which track offer the best, and choosing among all of this, rather than saying that, okay, we are only prioritizing the one. So from that perspective, you can easily see the pattern there that is shifting, or as some call the, let's say, forum shopping, that is going from the one pattern to another, going from one rhythm to another. That is, there is a maneuvering space in between all of these scenarios. One day you can demand this, the other day you do this, because there is a huge space that you can exploit and use for the maneuvering capabilities of yourself. From that perspective, I think for Azerbaijan, there are many scenarios, and as for Baku, it seems like the weather is fine as long as there is a military superiority, as long as the regional cards, both very locally and also globally, are in its favor. So that would be my short, quick take on these two issues.
Yes, I have to say, I mean, the whole point of the two corridors was that it was a quid pro quo. Russia would keep the Lachin corridor open in return, for some form of corridor across southern Armenia. Since the Lachin corridor no longer exists, it's hard to see the basis for asking for the other corridor. But on going back to an earlier question, the flight of the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. Having covered that war in the 1990s, I have to say that did not surprise me in the very slightest. The only thing that was going to give security to the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh would be either their own armed forces or a very significant international armed force of some kind. Now, a question to Lara. I know that Armenians are bitterly disappointed with Russia for basically the peacekeepers failing to defend the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh. But then again, of course, nobody else has either. The West, I'm extremely sorry that the ambassador doesn't seem to have made it, because I wanted obviously to address this question to him. But despite attempts at diplomatic involvement, there was never any question of Western countries sending their own peacekeepers to the area. So, I mean, does Armenia now find itself in practice actually isolated from everybody.
Not exactly. I think you are watching Armenia in the diversification of its foreign policy. It had chosen Russia out of necessity for very many years. And part of the deal was border security, which we did not see Russia able to enforce in September of last year when Azerbaijan attacked 5 points inside of Armenian territory. And you certainly didn't see it in the assault on Nagorno-Karabakh. But it was not sudden, and it was not surprising either. What was surprising was the breadth of the attack by Baku on the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh. No scenario imagined in the ceasefire deal of 2020 or any other imagined that part of this region completely depopulated of Armenians. And so that part was the surprise. But since the weeks surrounding the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just before the invasion of Ukraine, there was a very fateful meeting between Putin and Aliyev, essentially announcing new levels of strategic partnership between those two countries. And since the invasion of Ukraine, there has not been a demonstrable incident of Russia essentially acting as an effective referee between the Armenians and the Azeris. A French diplomat asked me during the 2020 war, what do you think is the prize for Russia here? And I said, I think it's Baku. I think it's a new relationship and a new working relationship with Baku. And I think they have that. So in a sense, Russia is unable, maybe unwilling, but certainly unable now, based on its dependencies, to live up to what it had pledged to Armenia. Armenia had tried to make moves toward the West over the past 30 years, and it was always stated by Moscow, but you need us for your security, we guard your borders, Azerbaijan, Turkey, threat, et cetera, et cetera. So now that that's gone, I think Armenia is diversifying its relationships with certainly a strong Armenia-India partnership emerging, new levels of cooperation with the West. Nobody expects boots on the ground, but certainly just whole new conversations around Armenia's orientation more toward the West in mind and in psyche and in other ways as well. You never say goodbye to regional neighboring countries. It's not possible, but I do think Armenia is diversifying its foreign policy and trying to avoid getting eaten for lunch. And that is the basic posture of Azerbaijan. Again, very interesting to listen to Shujaat, learned things I hadn't known already, but I do think the bigger context is very important. The enclaves, they're being called that in the course of the discussions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, so we'll continue to call them enclaves. But the parts of Armenia that are being demanded by Azerbaijan, whether they're, it's questionable. I understand Shujaat's joining us from Baku, that's the view in Baku, but whether they really ought to, so many years after the fall of the Soviet Union, be called legitimately part of Azerbaijan is questionable from a legal standpoint. But separate to that, when you have a very clear rhetoric from Baku, when you have a very clear stance and an escalating rhetoric around essentially reclaiming parts of territorial Armenia, sovereign Armenia, that rhetoric has only escalated since the 2020 war. In a state-backed rhetoric around Western Azerbaijan, which is essentially modern-day Armenia, belonging, being rightfully part of Azerbaijan, military drills, exercises between Turkey and Azerbaijan that are situated in precisely the points required in order to cut off southern Armenia and take that road by force, take that corridor by force. These are very troubling. The leading indicator of escalation is what Aliyev says domestically. It's not what he says in Brussels. It's not what he says to the US. And the rhetoric in Baku is extremely dangerous. And it speaks more of a growing appetite and a growing ambition, which plays very well domestically to continue making these gains and continuing to claim victory again and again and take more and more strategic pieces of Armenia than anything else. And that's what we're really very concerned about right now.
Well, this leads me actually to the first question from the audience, which is, what is the role of the United States in this crisis? And I suppose to add, what should it be? Because in general, America has been very hostile to Russian influence in the region. But of course, America has shown no sign of actually trying to replace that influence in military terms on the ground. So turning first to Shujaat, what do you think is the role for the United States in the region?
Well, I think this region has never been priority, or the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan has never been priority on the list, even the priority list for the stakeholders in Washington. From that perspective, we have always seen this conflict as being quite rare in terms of its nature, where there was a degree of cooperation even at the time of the global escalatory rhetoric between the US and other stakeholders involved, which...
excuse me, could you turn your microphone up a bit? I at least am finding it hard to hear you.
Is it okay now? Do you hear me? Okay, cool. So the point I was trying to make is that this region has never been priority zone for the US. From that perspective, we've never seen the US active involvement, with the exception of some periodic and episodic US engagements in terms of diplomatic, let's say, diplomatic intervention, the one being in the early 2000s in the Key West, the other being most recently after the war in Ukraine, that is the Biden administration trying to bring two sides together and they push for a peace deal, which is something that has been also mentioned in the press release coming from Washington. So from that perspective, especially with the new, unfortunately, the escalations emerging in the Middle East and its possible regional ramifications, I don't think that there is a possibility of this region, in specific, to be more specific, Armenia-Azerbaijan conflict theater becoming on the very top agenda for the US diplomat, so you can expect some sort of diplomatic intervention. I'm not even mentioning in a very hypothetical terms the possible military or other type of intervention that is also being more aligned with one country over another. So from that perspective, we unfortunately see a distancing rather than the more active involvement in terms of the diplomatic engagement. And with all this happening in the Ukraine and as well as in the Middle East, I think the dynamics in this region will be more and more ignored in other capitals, especially in the Western capitals. So from that perspective, I don't see the US taking part actively in one way or another in some sort of a security arrangement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And also we got to add the fact that there is an election period coming for the US, and that will be in 2024, which will be also quite turbulent in terms of the internal audience as well as for its geopolitical ramifications. So from that perspective, I think we'll probably see a bit less active US compared to the 2023 or 2022 summer when it comes to Armenia and Azerbaijan relations, rather than the more active. Yeah, that would be my take.
Lara, do you agree with that the US presence is likely to remain very limited?
I think it's very sound thinking and rationale. There are a few dimensional additions to consider. The US is a country that has a lot of leverage in this region with many of the key players, Georgia, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Armenia, certainly. And so this is a rare region where foreign policy objectives can be pursued without boots on the ground and without a very high cost financially. And so when we have looked at this and written about this in terms of the US role, there are quite a lot of tools that the US can use in terms of diplomacy, economic incentives, economic penalties to keep these two parties on track. So what the US role can be is really dictated by which of those tools it's willing to use. The US did play a pretty significant role in de-escalating, as we hear from internal sources, to the process, de-escalating the crisis in September 2022, where there was a security vacuum, a free fall, and there was no Russia to pick it up. It seemed as though Russia was going to let this, or not particularly stop it from escalating into an even more severe military conflict. And it does seem to be US policy and Secretary of State Blinken himself that was instrumental to de-escalating that. The US has passed a lot of the work on to the EU and EU member states to partner on. This is a very interesting case study. One day a PhD can be written on the attempt at division of labor between the US and Brussels on this particular issue. Let's see how it goes. And I think this is an interesting test of the EU and its ability to achieve any kind of foreign policy goal in its neighborhood, its eastern neighborhood. So we'll see. I don't think the US is without options. Political will does matter. The US was completely disengaged from the diplomatic process in 2020, in the fall of 2020, when the massive flare-up began. It ceded ground to Russia, in fact, by doing that. And then after Russia was clearly not only incapable, but we saw this become a real encumbrance on sovereign Armenian territory, that's when the US and the EU stood up, because it became now an issue of territorial sovereignty on Armenia's side. And frankly, an attack on Armenia's viability as a state is what we're seeing now from Azerbaijan and hearing from diplomats. So there is some sort of flurry of activity. Shujaat is very correct. There are a lot of elections coming up next year, not just in the United States, Russia, European countries involved in this game. There are not that many that are going to have a steady state necessarily in their foreign policy. The one thing I will also add to Shujaat's point is, I know that Azerbaijan wants to proceed with some sort of ceasefire peace deal on the basis of where things stand today after the September 19 escalation. Problem with that is we got to this status quo through ethnic cleansing, gross violation of human rights, gross violation of the Geneva Conventions, medieval siege of Nagorno-Karabakh. This is not stuff we're supposed to see in 2023, and a standing incursion on Armenian territory and very strategic locations that make this very dangerous status quo for Armenia. So simply saying, well, we got over the worst of it and now we can sign a deal based on where we stand today is massively flawed in every way, morally, legally, and also in terms of any hope for a stable peace between these two countries.
Yes, I mean, once again, I mean, in the 90s, one saw so much of this, on both sides. Admittedly, that was, almost 30 years ago now. But Shujaat, I'd like to ask you, if Azerbaijan could get a peace treaty recognizing its territorial integrity, according to Baku, would it drop its other demands or proposals, including for the corridor? Or in fact, is this now a permanent feature of Azeri policy to seek this corridor?
Well, I think in Azerbaijan, the rhetoric on the so-called corridor has been quite, let's say, visible, in a sense that they made it clear that they're fine with whatever option there, as long as it meets just some basic demand. That is where Armenia agrees that somehow would be connection between the western parts of Azerbaijan to Nakhchivan exclave should be secured and guaranteed. From their perspective,
this involves extraterritoriality.
Two options. Either Armenia officials say that no car will be touched, no car will be checked, no car will be, let's say, will be stopped, and there will be full security guarantees where whatever would be transferred. Or that is, as you said, extraterritoriality. That is Russia coming or others coming and saying that, okay, we have troops and we are safeguarding our Azerbaijani vehicles or whatever vehicles passing through the southernmost parts of Armenia. But as of now, I wouldn't say that the corridor and then whatever that is the biggest demand for Azerbaijan. It is rather part of a larger goal. And that is, coming back from what I said in the very beginning, I think as of now, in a couple of days, weeks, and a month, in both capitals, it will be determined, I would say, whether these two countries will go to the path of saying, okay, we don't have an agreement on most of the issues, then we continue using the absence or the presence of the vacuum to see whatever we can get. And also let's see what the others are offering us and compare these two and see what is the best, what is the better, so we can go for that over the another one, over the negotiated one, over negotiated within the specific platform, or it would be some sort of arrangement made. Here, I don't want to fetishize the peace agreement to a degree that it is a solution that will put an end to every single outstanding issue between Azerbaijan and Armenia. At the end of it is a piece of paper. And the most important thing is not assigning a piece of paper. It's thinking about the implementing what was signed there, because I assume the peace agreement will be quite ambiguous in most of the terms. That is, Armenia and Azerbaijan adhering to blah, 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 blah principles, this, according to this charter resolution, so on and so forth. But how it will be executed, given the geopolitical space is becoming more and more complex. will it be possible to achieve predictability? Will it be possible to achieve institutional cooperation between the two states? These are the questions. I think the execution, implementation is much more problematic than the signing it off. So from that perspective, I won't fetishize the peace agreement to a degree, but my personal opinion is that any agreement is better than no agreement, because no agreement, coming from memory that I have, and pretty much all of us have, that is, when we don't have an agreement, when there is no agreement, when there is no agreement at all, even on the table, we are often going to the handbook of the tools that are not, let's put it in the very simple terms, that are not negotiated ones, but rather coercive ones from both ends. From that perspective, still I would prefer an agreement over no agreement, but I would still rather focus on the ways in which it can be implemented and sustained. Because there is a research as well saying that a considerable part of the peace agreements fail within the 5 years of period of signing, even when there are no, let's say, tangible or workable mechanisms of enforcing the parts of the deal. So I think for Armenians, for Azerbaijanis at large, not only in those two countries, but also globally, the focus should be to think of the workable, let's say, mechanism, so we can keep this would-be deal workable and there. So that would be my answer.
There have been several questions from the audience about the role of Iran. We know that Iran has been seriously concerned about Israeli help to Azerbaijan, and also greatly dislikes the idea of a corridor that would cut or potentially cut Iranian links north to Georgia and Russia. Lara, how do you see the role of Iran? Is, of course, a long-standing, in certain respects, partner of Armenia. Certainly played a critical role in helping Armenia in the early 1990s. But are good Armenian relations with Iran incompatible with better Armenian relations with the United States?
From every vector we have looked at as a think tank, Armenia-Iran relations are overplayed in terms of their scope. Trade with Iran and Azerbaijan is robust. Strategic conversations between those two countries continue. Iran is unfortunately the unavoidable neighbor in this region. And so you do see some degree of accommodation that Armenia has to make and that Azerbaijan has to make. There is gas import from, of course, Iran to Armenia, but there isn't quite a lot of other bilateral trade beyond that. What makes Iran a player in this game from Armenia's perspective is that they are the only one who has enough interest and enough footprint to push back on a changing of the border. But pushing back on a changing of the border is exactly what the US is calling for, what the EU is calling for. This is a very strange situation where interests are very, very intertwined, and very oddly so. Armenia has made it very clear to the EU and to the West that they would like more partnership with the Western world. And there is some capacity building that's begun. And again, with India, with others, it's just a general diversification away from over-reliance on Russia. And that's been the one clear trend from Armenia. There was just a meeting in Tehran over this issue. You had Armenia there, Azerbaijan there, Russia, Turkey. And so Iran wants to stay at the center of these conversations. There's what's known as the 3+3 format: Turkey, Iran, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, etc. And so they're very interested. Iran is very interested in the West not having a role in this game. Azerbaijan and Turkey and Russia rather like that as well. So frankly, it's a bit more of the autocracies of the region preferring to stay among themselves, having accommodations, having a horse trading dynamic, rather than the presence of the US or the EU and their ability to pull off a lasting peace deal. So they will remain spoilers. They will remain major issues here. And I know Armenia has managed to stay on the right side of all things sanctions related. It has a lot of open, we interview quite often the central bank governor here in Armenia. It's been very interesting how Armenia has managed traditionally to balance its neighboring relations with Iran and its broader outreach to international partners. But that has pretty much held up, and that's holding up in this process as well. That's part of what makes it so dangerous if we do see an escalation. around southern Armenia, is that you likely will see Iran involved in pushing back, and then you'll have Iran, Turkey, Azerbaijan, many players in a weird soup of kinetic conflict. So we'll see where that goes. We'll see where that goes.
Yes, I do have to remark that Iran has been present there for 2,500 years. America has been present for how long?
You did, though. There was, and I think it's very important. I know you mentioned that in the 90s, a lot of bad things were done on both sides, and that's absolutely true. And there's a long conversation that these two countries need to have, Armenia and Azerbaijan, about history. The 30 years after that, it was assumed we were moving toward a negotiations process, a civilized 21st century diplomatic process. And in that process, the US, Russia, and France, and the other members of the OSCE Minsk group were all part of this conversation. They were all happy to partner on this. It was kind of a romantic project, post-Soviet project. Let's all get together and solve a problem. It didn't work for a number of reasons, but there was a US presence since independence here has flourished. English is now one of the major languages of Armenia. That's inconceivable 30 years ago, 40 years ago. So the US has a major footprint here. It's just now that a strategic opportunity is opening up, that you are seeing more dynamism around the US interest in Armenia as a partner, around what might happen next in this region. Obviously, closely allied with Turkey, has many links to Azerbaijan, but there is a dynamism here on the ground. It's very interesting to watch. No hard security guarantees from the West, but with Armenia between a rock and a hard place, it's basically trying to piece together its future security architecture and its future trajectory based on how it can work with all these different partners.
Question, how can Armenia turn really to the West when two of its borders are closed? And still, I mean, as I understand it, its energy relationship is with Iran, and its principal trade remains with Russia.
Its energy relationship is with Iran and Russia primarily. And what you're seeing in Armenia now is a massive push toward energy independence. It's going to be very interesting to see which partner they go with on the renewal of nuclear energy in this country. That's going to be a major pivot point to be watching. Any announcements around whether it's Russia, France, or the US, who will be part of that picture. A massive uptake of solar, renovation of hydro. This sounds like just nice, fuzzy, fluffy stuff, but this country is being transformed from an energy perspective, but through many vectors. Armenians want it, the West wants it. And so you're seeing a major shift in the energy dependence. And precisely what you said, the economic dependency on Russia and other factors as well that are marking, this is a country whose civil society looks much more like Eastern Europe and Western Europe than it does like Russia, or frankly, other countries in the neighborhood. So there are many ways in which the West has already imprinted on this country, and where this country is trying to move westward in many of its norms, values, and practices. And so the decoupling from Russia in general, not the complete wave bye-bye, but the diversification in all those fields is what is being worked on now. It's what's happening.
Shujaat, a question about Turkey's role. Is the idea of a Turkic world led from Ankara still alive? And does this have resonance in Baku?
The question is still alive would mean that there was somehow a policy in Ankara of creating a Turkic world by creating some sort of, let's say, supranational institutions, which I doubt, to be honest, because Ankara, even though it has a soft power and potential, and there's also, you can go through the data, you can see that there is an increased Turkish footprint in both Central Asia and the South Caucasus, but Ankara is lacking the capacity of projecting the security and economy-wise power to the Central Asian countries, as well as the South Caucasian countries, but largely to the Central Asian countries, so they can replace their already existing, that is Russia, or would be, that is China or Iran, guarantors or partners or allies to a Turkey only, which is something that is even in a very hypothetical terms impossible as of now, not because there is no desire in Ankara, but rather because there is little capacity, because Turkey, as a matter of fact, is a huge state, but still it does not have the power projection capacity like the others, namely Russia and China, do. So from that perspective, yes, you can have some national sentiments among some individuals, which is quite natural for many countries in the most of the globe, but you don't have these being executed as an official policy. You don't see this. Yes, Turkey is becoming more and more active in its foreign policy making. It is moving in between the pan-Islamism to a degree because of the ideological, let's say, ideological stance of the ruling party. There's also the degree of pan-Turkism. You can see on this rhetoric, we can see that institutions. There's an organization called Organization of Turkish States. There are other types of the soft power means. But in these two important domains, that is first security and the other economy, you don't have this because the Turkey as a state is not in the same role as China, as Russia, so it can, let's say, project its already existing power beyond its borders. It can to a limited degree, but not the full capacity, so that it can be an attractive model for Central Asian countries. So from that perspective, I wouldn't even consider as an existing plan rather than something of emotional thinking, which is, I believe, in the heart of the many countries, not only Turkey. But on the other hand, I think we need to discuss more the role of Iran in this regard. I think here a couple of points are needed because Armenian-Iranian relations are also there because of the Azerbaijani-Iranian relations, because these two things cannot be separated from each other. So from that perspective, I think because there have been some questions on the possible Iranian interference on behalf of Armenia. I think here we got to understand one thing. For Iran, the past 3 decades, the weather was fine. Why? Because the Russian Federation was acting as the main security umbrella for all the 3 countries involved. That was keeping away the Western countries, as well as keeping the things under control. Now, after the 2022 and the invasion of Ukraine and the failures that Russia faced there, it prompted Iran to get actively involved. But the thing is, there's a threshold and there's a limitations. The first is that Iran in the past 40 years never ever involved in an interstate conflict with its land troops getting actively used against one state and one army. It rather preferred to use proxy forces in other countries, in other conflicting areas, in order to implement its own agenda, with the exception of the Iranian-Iraqi conflict that happened in the 80s. Other than that, Iran has never ever taken place in any kind of active combat with its armed forces involved. So Iranian policy is coming from the 2, let's say, calculations. The first is there's a need to have a presence, but we don't have this financial institution capacity to have a full presence. So we're going to use our proxy forces there or create the proxy forces so that we can sustain and have some presence. That is the playbook in Yemen, in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iraq, in Syria. And the thing is, it is quite problematic to have this playbook used in Armenia and Azerbaijan, as long as these 2 countries are sovereign, as long as these 2 countries are independent, as long as these 2 countries are not, quote unquote, Syria, referring to in terms of the conflict domain. So from that perspective, if we want to just prevent our countries turning into the countries where anyone from the outside can come in and can establish their own footprint at the expense of the Armenian and Azerbaijani sovereignty, I think the best way of dealing with that is just normalizing just having a normal neighborly relations. And yes, the path is very problematic, especially after the September 19th, that is quite problematic, but I think the decoupling of Armenia can take place practically only after it achieves at least a normalization with Turkey in a very practical terms. And we all know this depends hugely on normalization with Azerbaijan. So from that perspective, I definitely second what Lara said on how Armenia kind of tangled in between all of this, not choices between the good and bad, but rather bad and worse, to be honest, if we put it in that way.
Thank you so much. I do have to remark, though, that the call for an extraterritorial route has been a very questionable one in modern history, and one that a sovereign state is very unlikely to accede to, in my view, if it has any choice in the matter. I'm so sorry, we have come to the end of our time. I apologize to everyone whose questions I did not have time to pass on. But I would like to thank Shujaat and Lara very much for your most interesting remarks on a very important and somewhat tragic subject. Thank you.